Hello and welcome to Breaking Down History. I'm Dr. Dickens.
My name is Mr. Pritchard.
And this week we're going to be looking at the question of how the USA gained independence. Now, last time out we looked at India gaining its independence from the British Empire. Let's roll it back to that point. What do we mean by independence?
Well, what we're talking about is colonies or countries that have gained their freedom from an empire. So if we're thinking about the example of India, India were ruled by the British Empire. They were a colony in the British Empire. And in 1947, as we discussed last time, they gained their independence. So they became a free country. They're in charge of themselves. They're making their own decisions.
Fantastic. Now, one of the things that we're going to invite you to do in this podcast is have a think back to the case of India and how India became independent, and think, is the situation in India different or similar to the United States of America? Are their independence movements similar or are they different? Okay. Now, let's give the context or the idea of the United States of America. What is the United States of America? Where is it? And what's the time period that we're discussing here?
So when we talk about the United States of America, in the modern day, we're talking about a huge country that spans from the east to the west coast of the continent of North America. However, what we're talking about in this podcast is we're talking about a selection of colonies that had been ruled by Britain and other countries since around sort of 1600s. So in 1497, sailors from Britain, John Cabot in particular, discovered parts of North America for the Europeans. So they travelled across the Atlantic in boats and they claimed that these lands were now going to belong to the British or the Spanish or whoever it might have been. Then obviously you've got to think about the fact that they're not really discovering these lands, and that actually the Native Americans had lived here for hundreds, in some cases thousands of years. There were a group of people that these lands belongs to. However, that does not matter to the European powers, and Britain by 1763 had control of most of what is now the eastern part of the USA. So there were 13 different colonies up and down the east coast that Britain had taken control of. Some of them you might have heard of, like New York or Massachusetts or North Carolina, and they controlled all of these different colonies. Now, between 1763 and 1776, relationships between the British colonies and the British Empire deteriorated. They got so bad that by 1776, these colonies had become independent, and that is where you have the sort of start of the U.S.A.
Okay, and this is what we're really going to be focusing on, isn't it? We're going to be looking at how we get from these 13 colonies being ruled by Britain to an independent United States of America.
Absolutely.
Okay, now, how should we be taking notes as we're watching this podcast?
So what we would like you to do is to make a mind map or a spider diagram with American independence at the center of it. We're going to be talking about 4 different causes of independence. So these 4 causes you're going to need to have as branches to your spider diagram. One of the causes is taxation without representation, or you can always just put taxation. Another cause is British actions. Another are the actions of the American colonists. And then finally, you've got the War of Independence. So if you want to get those down onto your spider diagram, have a look at the screen and we'll start talking about those in a second.
So let's start off by looking at the issue of taxation or taxes. Now, Mr. Pritchard, you mentioned the year of 1763 as the year that all of this started. What actually happens in 1763?
So in 1763, there is a famous war called the 7 Years' War. Sometimes it gets called the French and Indian War. And this is a war in which Britain and the American colonists fought against France and some of their colonists, and there were also Native Americans involved in the fight as well. But the important thing is, at the end of this war, in 1763, Britain is victorious. They defeat France and they gain lots of land in America that had previously belonged to them. As a result of this, at the end of this war, in 1763, Americans are incredibly proud of being British. They are really sort of proud of the fact that they've defeated this great empire, they've taken part in this war, and they've helped the motherland, if you like, by defeating this enemy. However, later on, you have 13 years later even, you have the Americans wanting to get rid of the British. So in a very small amount of time, things change quite dramatically from having these very proud Americans who had considered the generals of the war to be American heroes and who had adored the King, King George. They now actually want rid of the British.
So we've gone from a situation where Americans are fighting for the British and they're winning a war for the British and they're proud that they're part of the British Empire, to 13 years later, they're trying to get rid of the British altogether from America. What went wrong in this time? What changed in those 13 years?
So if you remember, the key group of people that are living on this land at the time are the Native Americans who originally own this land and who had it taken from them by the British, by the French, and by the American colonists as well. Now, these Native Americans, they are not happy with their new British rulers, and there is a rebellion called Pontiac's Rebellion, where some of the Native Americans decide to fight against the British, to attack some of the forts, and to cause havoc. And what this means is that the British need to keep their army in America. They need to keep their army that had just won this war there in order to protect their lands.
Okay, so how does this actually affect the colonists who are living in America, those Europeans who've settled and now live in America?
Well, if you're going to keep any army, you've got to pay them a lot of money. You've got to pay for obviously their weapons and their uniform, but also it costs a lot to simply keep them stationed out there. And they've also just fought this war, the British. So you've got a situation where the British are in £130 million of debt as a result of these two different wars. And they need money. So how are they going to get money? How are they going to pay for this army?
I've got a funny idea. It might have something to do with tax. Is that right?
Absolutely. So they're going to tax the American colonists. And what that means is they're going to charge the American colonists money on different items. So a tax maybe, for example, when the Americans are paying for their tea, there's going to be a tax on it, which means some of that money will go to Britain instead. So the Americans are going to have to pay more. Yeah.
Now, just to be clear, we're talking about the tax, which is where a government takes money from the people that it rules, right?
Absolutely.
And the issue here, potentially, is that it's the British government that is taking the tax from people who are living in America. And obviously the British government is based in Britain,
Yep.
but these people are out living in America thousands and thousands of miles away.
Absolutely. And the British mindset behind it was they were saying, right, well, hang on, we've just defended you. We've just won this war for you. This is for your benefit. So it's only fair if you now help pay for the army. That's the sort of British mindset. They felt this was just a fair thing to ask for. It's fair to say the Americans didn't agree with that at all. The Americans believed that this was incredibly unfair. And there are a series of taxes in particular that led to this conflict between the two groups. So in 1764 and 1765, you have the Sugar and Stamp Acts, where they put taxes on those items. Then in 1767, you have something called the Townshend Acts, where lots more taxes are put on lots of different goods. And then finally, in 1773, there is something called the Tea Act, where they try to tax tea, which obviously is a very dangerous thing to do.
So, would I be right in thinking that Americans at this time just hated paying tax? They don't want to pay any tax at all?
That is the argument that British historians sometimes come up with, that they just disliked tax, and that's not really true. The Americans paid tax. The colonists paid lots of taxes, but they paid them to their local governments. What they objected to, what they had an issue with, was paying taxes to the British Empire, which are stationed across the ocean, because they think this is an unfair tax to pay. They don't think it's fair for them to be paying twice. They also really, really dislike this idea because they believe that they are being taxed without representation. And the phrase that some American writers coined at this time is that taxation without representation is a form of tyranny.
Right, hold on. Let's just take a look at that phrase. So, we've got taxation without representation is tyranny. There's three key words here, aren't there? We've got taxation, which is where the government is taking money from people to
Yeah.
pay for things, right?
So they're saying that they want representation. So what that means is they want to have, if they're going to be taxed, they think it's fair that there are American colonists or people working on behalf of them that are in Parliament, in government, standing up and speaking up for the Americans. And at this point in time, this is not happening. The Americans are being taxed and they're having decisions made about them, but they're not having any say in these decisions. They're just having to take all of these harsh measures.
So in that case, we could be saying that the Americans might have been happy paying these taxes if the British had allowed them to have their own people in British Parliament. Is that right?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And what the key thing here is that the Americans just want their say. They just want to feel like they are able to contribute and they can have a fair say in what's going on. They're not just rejecting the taxes, they just want to have representation.
Okay, so they're saying taxation without representation. In other words, if we have to pay tax without being able to have our people in Parliament, they're saying that is tyranny.
Yeah.
And what does that word tyranny mean?
Well, tyranny is where you have a cruel or oppressive government that is really controlling, that maybe doesn't allow you to make your own decisions and is really restrictive in what it wants you to do. And that's what they're accusing the British of at this point in time.
Okay, so is this fair to say that this is all a fight over money?
Yes and no. It is in the sense that money is being taken from the Americans. No one necessarily likes paying tax, but really the issue is more complex than that. They're saying that actually what they want is a voice, and that's the key thing the Americans are arguing about.
So we've seen that the British government is starting to introduce these taxes that people in America have to pay. How do the colonists, the people who are living in America at the time, how do they respond to this?
So, for example, when the Stamp Act is introduced, there is rioting in loads of the colonies across America. People are angry about these new taxes. And not only are ordinary people angry about them, but the people that are in government in different parts of the American colonies, they oppose it as well.
Okay, now why is the Stamp Act the act or the tax which starts all these rebellions off?
This is one of the first real taxes that the British put on the Americans. So it's one of the first times the British are taxing the Americans. These are people that have moved away from Britain to start a new life, and they're being taxed by this old government. So they're angry and they voice their anger, and what that eventually results in is the British repealing the act. And what that means is that they said, okay, we're not going to tax you in this way. Clearly we have maybe misunderstood it. Don't get me wrong, the British were still wanting to tax the Americans, but they thought they had to be a bit more clever about it. And this pattern continues. So you've got the British introducing a tax, the Americans getting very angry, and then the British repealing the tax. This happens over and over again. And in particular, this is true in Boston.
Okay, now why is Boston important?
Boston is, in some ways, the heart of the American independence movement. It's where a lot of the key events happen. It's where a lot of the key people involved come from. So, in particular, the Sons of Liberty, who are this famous revolutionary group who want to get American independence, they form in Boston. Also, there are two very key events that take place in Boston: the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
So what happens in these two events then? We've got the Boston Massacre, we've got the Boston Tea Party. What's going on here?
So the Boston Massacre in 1770, there is an argument that takes place. There are lots of British troops stationed in Boston, and there's an argument that starts to take place between some colonists and some British troops, and it's about taxes, and it's about some of the things that the colonists had been angry about for a long time. And during this argument, it starts to escalate. The British, very arrogant, objects, snowballs and other items are thrown at the British, and this actually escalates to the point where you've got a crowd of people shouting and screaming and throwing things at the British. This eventually involves a private, who was called Private Montgomery, firing his gun into the crowd, and other soldiers followed. They then shot into the crowd as well. You then have 5 colonists being killed in what is called the Boston Massacre, and this changes things because now you've got, for one of the first times, American colonists dying at the hands of their supposed British rulers. These are people that are almost meant to be cousins, and yet you've got this clash, violent clash between them.
And I suppose this is really important if we're thinking about what the British government meant to people in America, because the British government are saying, we are the government which are going to tax you. We still sort of consider you part of Britain and certainly part of the British Empire. But then when the American colonists are protesting about what's happening and what the government is doing, the British government is actually attacking those people.
Exactly. So it changes the perception, it changes the attitude of the colonists towards the British. They view them in a new light. The second key event you've got is the Boston Tea Party. Now, this is a really, really famous event in history. And it was where the colonists, again, angry at a tax, in particular the tea tax this time, they dressed up as North Americans and they climbed aboard loads of boats that belonged to the East India Company. And they threw 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbour.
So, hold on, just to get this clear, we've got these colonists, these people who originally had come over from Britain. They were now living in North America, and they dressed up as Native Americans, is that right? And
yeah.
they go onto this ship and they're throwing this tea off the side.
Absolutely.
Okay, what on earth is going on here?
Well, they're angry about the tea tax. This isn't, by the way, a small thing. The British had made it so that the American colonists could only buy their tea from this one company, and this was a British company. So the British were trying to get rich off of this. And they resented this tax so much that they threw, and this isn't just a little bit of tea they're throwing into the harbour, this is millions of dollars worth of tea. So this is a big protest. This is the colonists showing the British, this is what we think of your taxes, and this is what we're willing to do to you if you don't stop them.
So we've so far seen the American colonists who are protesting about these taxes. They're even sometimes violently protesting. So we've got the Boston Tea Party where they're throwing that tea overboard. How did the British government deal with these colonists when they were protesting?
So we've talked obviously about the massacre. We've got the fact that the British are consistently responding with violence in some cases. They're not exactly taking a soft approach to the American colonists. But the other thing that you may have noticed is that the British keep introducing these taxes. They're not really learning their lesson from the fact that the Americans don't want these taxes and instead are continually introducing them. And what this eventually leads to is the Americans becoming incredibly frustrated and feeling like they're not being listened to. And I think that's true. The British are not really listening to the demands of the colonists. They're not trying to give them representation, and they're not trying to deal with the problem.
So I suppose we could think of a similar situation in our own lives, and you could do this at home as well. Let's say you've got a certain chore that you really hate doing at home, but your parents at home are saying, well, you've got to do this, and you're protesting. If you're continually being told you've got to do this, you might think in the end that you're just not being listened to at all. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think that's also can lead to a lot of frustration on the part of the people that aren't being listened to. So you've got this British almost ignorance, ignoring the Americans. You've also got this violence. But then, in particular, after the Tea Party, after this big rebellion where they're throwing the tea into Boston Harbour, you have what is called the Intolerable Act. And this is a law where the British decided that they were going to punish Boston, the city of Boston, for this rebellion, for this Tea Party. And they introduced lots of new laws. So one of the things they do is they shut down Boston Harbour. They blockade, so they get lots of different ships and they cut off the harbour. So that means that no business can come in, and that's where all of Boston made their money. This angered the people of Boston because now you're punishing the entire city for the actions of some of the rebels. And that actually just made more people want to join the sort of rebellions. At the same time as well, they also did things like they started taking away democratic power from the people of the state of Massachusetts. So previously, the people of this area had been able to vote for people to go into the local government, and they took away those powers. So what you've got here is the British taking back some of the freedom that the American colonists had enjoyed.
And I suppose that's particularly ironic, isn't it, or particularly strange as an action for the British to take, because one of the big complaints that the American colonists had was that they wanted more freedoms and they wanted this idea of representation where they could elect people to the government.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, whilst this is happening in one colony, it's the message it sends to all the other colonies. If you dare to cross the British, we're going to take more away from you. And what that actually does to the other colonies is it makes them think, okay, well, maybe this isn't the best long-term solution. Maybe we should break away from the British Empire.
Okay, so far we've got the American colonists who are protesting against the British. They think that what they're doing is unfair. We've got the British who are then punishing people in Boston and people in Massachusetts. But how does all of this lead to America gaining its independence after 1776?
So the key thing is, when the British are doing these different taxes, when they are punishing the colonies, what they are hoping for is that the colonies are going to fall in line, that they're going to punish them and the colonies are going to say, yeah, fair enough, okay. And that is the opposite of what happens. Instead, these laws cause the colonies to become more united against the British. And you've got actually 13 different colonies that were very, very different in terms of the people that lived there, uniting to fight back against the British. They send supplies to Boston during the blockade to help the people of Boston. And more colonists begin to join these groups like the Sons of Liberty.
Okay, now what actions did the colonists actually take?
So in 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives, so people that were elected by those regions, to the First Continental Congress. And this was a response to the blockades and the intolerable acts that had been taking place the previous year. And this is an incredibly important event because for one of the first ever times, you've got these colonies actually coming together, the most important politicians coming together to decide what they are going to do about the British problem. And they send a petition to King George asking him to repeal, to get rid of these intolerable acts, to get rid of these laws that had been restricting them. And they don't get any response.
Now, hold on. 1774, you've said we've got all of these colonies coming together and they've sent a petition, almost like a letter of request, to the King in England, King George III, to say, we want you to do things differently. Right. If the British had said, all right, we'll listen to your concerns and we'll change what we're doing, does that mean that war with Britain or between Britain and America could actually have been stopped at that time?
It is absolutely possible. There were still lots of Americans that, whilst they were angry at the British, they still wanted to stay a part of Britain. Some of them considered themselves to be British. So it's not, out of the question that Britain could have avoided this war, could have avoided this catastrophe. And the key thing you have here, and you can see it with King George, he just doesn't respond. And that is the consistent theme with Britain. They just don't listen to what the Americans are asking them for. The Americans here are not getting together and starting a war. They're getting together and writing him a petition. That's a fair thing to ask. But the British absolutely reject that. They think that that is a preposterous thing for these American colonists to ask for. And what the colonists end up doing is they end up establishing a boycott of British goods. So they decide to stop buying British goods as a way of trying to persuade the British.
Okay, so we've talked about the Continental Congress and the American colonists starting this boycott of British goods. Why is all of this important?
Because now you've got this unity of the different colonies, and now you've got these different colonies taking a united front. So they're working together to try and deal with the British threat. By 1775, relationships between Britain and the colonies have gotten so bad that a war breaks out between them. Some British troops are sent to deal with some American rebels. They're told to get them to stand down, to break up these rebellions, and this actually ends up with the soldiers firing at each other and the outbreak of war. And you've now got this war, which is called the War of Independence, or the War of the American Revolution, and this is the beginning of the end.
Now, I suppose when you're listening to this at home, you could be starting to draw a comparison between what's going on in America in 1774 and 1775 and what we saw in India a couple of weeks ago. Because in India, we started to see that demands for independence and the idea that you could control your own country were starting to come about in wartime.
Absolutely. There's loads of comparisons between the two. What is key, though, about the American situation is that they have to go to war to get rid of the British. And once they've gone to war, about a year in on the 4th of July 1776, enough of the Americans have actually realised that the British are not going to back down, that they're not going to give them the freedom or the rights that they are asking for, and that the only option now is independence. And on the 4th of July, American Independence Day, they sign the Declaration of Independence.
So, 4th of July 1776, these American colonies sign this Declaration of Independence. Does this mean that the United States of America is now an independent country?
Yes and no. They have claimed their independence. However, they are still fighting a war with the British. The British very much considered them property of the British Empire. And so for the next 8 years or so, from 1775, the next 8 years, you have this war taking place between the British and Americans. And that culminates in 1781, where they surrender the British at Yorktown, and you've got the end of the war. And then 2 years later, in 1783, the peace treaty is signed, and the 13 colonies of America become the United States of America. So they declare their independence in 1776, and by 83, they are officially an independent country.
Overall then, what were the main causes of American independence? How did they become an independent country?
So the key thing you've got is this issue over taxation, the fact that Americans want to be represented in order to be taxed. Taxation without representation is not good enough. But you've also got, alongside that, the fact that the British are not listening, they're not being flexible, and they're not basically responding to what the Americans are asking of them. That is the key, I would say, the key two causes. However, on the flip side of that, how they achieve that is a very different matter. The Americans don't just accidentally fall into independence. They have to protest, they have to start movements and campaigns, and ultimately they have to go to war in order to get the British out. So what we're going to do now is, I've talked for long enough, so I'm going to ask Dr. Dickinson questions about some of the different similarities and differences that you can see with the Indian movement. So what similarities can you see between the Indian movement for independence and the American movement?
Right, okay. The first one that I think is really important is the role of war, because both with India in the First World War and the Second World War, and with America, so for example, starting off with the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, you've got war as a really important thing that's starting people thinking about independence. There's also the idea of representation and democracy, so how much freedom people have and how much roles they have or how much power they have in government. And of course in India we have groups like the Indian National Congress, who were demanding a bit more representation, a bit more power in the government. And we have, in America, obviously, this idea of no taxation without representation.
Okay. Sorry.
I was going to say, I also think that the British reaction's quite similar. So in India, you've got, for example, the British refusing to introduce massive changes. So they introduced some changes in how India's ruled, but not everything. And actually, in America, it seems that they completely refuse to listen at all.
Yeah, absolutely. They are repealing taxes, but they're not really listening to the core of what the Americans are saying.
Yeah.
So what are the differences then in these two movements?
Okay, well, I think one difference is the idea of nationalism. With the Indian independence movement, lots of Indians very quickly decided that they needed their own country and that they had their own nation. And what we mean by that is that all Indians belonged in a country that they could run together. I don't think we get that as much in America, because for a long time, lots and lots of Americans really believed that they were British or they were part of the British Empire, right?
Absolutely.
The other difference, I think, is that in America, the American colonists needed to fight the British to get their independence. So they needed to pick up weapons, they needed to start the war with the British to win independence. And that's not quite the same in India, because in India it's a bit more peaceful in the sense that the British agree, without going to war with the Indians, that they're going to give India their independence.
Okay, so hopefully throughout that you've been able to answer our main question of how did the USA gain independence. Make sure you've got your notes. If you need to use the timestamps in the description of the video to go back to particular sections, do that. And next week we are going to be asking you to compare the two independence movements. So thank you for listening, and talk to you soon.